All right, so I want to welcome everybody back to the third installment of the FITSNews Week in Review. Thanks for joining us. Glad you're here. We've got a lot to cover. I want to start with a Democratic tax cut. And yes, my instinct is to tell Dylan to stop the cameras and start over because I made a mistake. But no, there is actually a Democratic tax cut in South Carolina that we're going to talk about on the program today. We've also got some big news on medical marijuana, including an exclusive interview we did earlier this week with State Senator Tom Davis, who has been pushing this bill for 7 years. He's the lead sponsor. He sat down right here, talked to us about the status of the bill. Dylan's got some news this week. He basically kicked a local educrat here in the Midlands region of the state squarely in the balls, figuratively, although from the response you would think it was literal. Dylan's going to come on camera and tell you about that story. We've got Liz down in Beaufort. She's going to tell us about her story on a lawyer in South Carolina who was disbarred for stealing their client's identity. Executive editor Liz Farrell had a big story on that. She's going to come on and tell you a little bit about that. We've got some other stuff on the agenda. Glad you're here. Let's sit down and get to the week in review. All right, so the first story I wanted to talk about this week was one we covered. It involved a Democratic lawmaker from Folly Beach, South Carolina. Her name is Spencer Wetmore. She was elected in August of 2020, a special election. That fall, she was elected to a full 2-year term. So she's basically a freshman lawmaker, basically a term and a half in office. Spencer Wetmore was selected by her party to give the Democratic response to Governor Henry Mcmaster's State of the State address. Now, if you missed this speech, don't worry. Nobody watched it. Nobody watched it. Literally 1,200 views on the SCETV YouTube page. That's pathetic. I can get on Twitter and say something stupid and get that much traffic. Anyway, I wanted to raise attention to this speech, though, because it's very significant politically, because Spencer Wetmore did something that I haven't heard a Democrat do in a long time, a very long time. In fact, we've got a clip of her speech. Let's go to that right now and hear what she had to say.
Let's start by working together to provide tax relief to working families who actually need it. And let's do it this legislative session.
What? Yeah, man. You heard that. That's what she said. Tax relief to working South Carolinians, to people who need it most. Now, again, Representative Wetmore did not provide a specific policy proposal, but she did say tax cuts, tax relief, not tax reform, which we all know from the Republican leadership over the last 2 decades. That basically means picking money from one pocket and putting it in the other. Okay, that's tax reform. Spencer Wetmore said tax cuts. So that's a big deal, and it puts tremendous pressure on the Republican leaders in both the House and the Senate to come up with a comprehensive tax relief, again, not reform, relief proposal that actually gives money back to South Carolinians. Now, we've done a couple videos, a lot of posts talking about how North Carolina is moving forward with a very aggressive tax cut, $13.5 billion over the next 6 years. That is a huge cut, and it's going to make North Carolina tremendously competitive economically. South Carolina needs to match that or do better. Unfortunately, as we wrote about a couple weeks ago and talked about in one of our previous editions of this show, Governor Henry Mcmaster, he needs some tax cut Viagra. With $5.73 billion in new money coming into Columbia this year, he's proposed $177 million in tax relief. It's pathetic. It's pathetic. It's basically 3 cents out of every dollar. So it'll be very interesting to see what Representative Wetmore and her Democratic colleagues come up with in terms of that low-income tax relief. It's also going to be very interesting to see what South Carolina Senate Finance Chairman Harvey Peeler comes up with, because we hear he's working on a big tax plan, some significant relief above and beyond what the governor has proposed. So if you pay taxes in South Carolina, follow this debate. It's going to be very important for your bottom line moving forward. Another big issue we covered this week is the ongoing debate over medical marijuana in South Carolina. Now, if you're a regular reader, viewer, subscriber to FITSNews, you know where I am on this issue. I mean, I wish that's where I was. I've been sober like 15 years, but I support not only the legalization of marijuana, but other drugs. I'm a libertarian. What can I say? Now, Tom Davis, state senator from Beaufort County, South Carolina, one of my good friends, we go way back. It was actually in my wedding. He's been a floor leader on this fight. In fact, he's been a leader for the last 7 years trying to push to get a vote on this bill. And this week, his bill, Senate Bill 150, the Compassionate Care Act, was set for special order, which means it got a special place on the calendar ahead of all the other bills that lawmakers are considering this year, a priority piece of legislation, and debate began on that bill this week. Senator Davis took the floor, and as soon as that debate was over, he came by our studios to tell us a little bit about his legislation. Here's a clip from that interview.
Yeah, like in 2014, I was speaking at a Rotary Club, as politicians do, and after talking about tax policy and education reform and whatever we were working on in the General Assembly, wrapping up, the speech, and then afterwards, a woman in her 60s came up to me and said, "I want you to hear my story about my granddaughter, and I want you to consider legalizing cannabis to help her epilepsy." And that was really the first time I had ever heard marijuana mentioned in the context of something that could be efficacious for medical purposes. And so I dug into it and realized that, in fact, that was true, that there was a substantial body of medical evidence out there that shows that cannabis interacts with your endocannabinoidal system. Everybody has an endocannabinoidal system. And epilepsy and seizures are a result, in large part, because that endocannabinoidal order in the body is messed up somehow. And so there's something about the way cannabis interacts with that body that helps mitigate those seizures. And primarily the portion of marijuana that's called CBD. You've got two derivatives of marijuana, two primary derivatives. You got CBD, and then you got THC, which is the psychoactive component.
What gets you high?
Correct. And it's the CBD component that really provided relief in regard to epilepsy. So that 2014 bill authorized cannabis to be used to treat epilepsy patients, but it set a cap on the THC at 0.9% THC.
And that was your bill?
That was my bill. And we got that bill passed, signed into law by Governor Haley in 2014. And I know from firsthand experience, it has provided relief to so many children, so many adults that were treating epilepsy or trying to treat epilepsy with drugs, pharmaceuticals that really didn't give them a quality of life. And this gave them a way to address their seizures and to still maintain the quality of life. It was a very rewarding experience.
But one of the other things Senator Davis mentioned during the interview is that 37 other states have already passed a medical marijuana bill. In fact, just this week, Mississippi passed a very broad bill, one significantly wider than the legislation that's currently under consideration in South Carolina, wider in terms of the categories of use for medical marijuana. So again, be on the lookout for changes to this bill. Perhaps we can get even more exemptions in the South Carolina bill that Senator Davis is pushing. The senator also pointed out that there is widespread public support for his legislation amongst Republicans, independents, and Democrats. So whatever your partisan persuasion, chances are if you live in South Carolina, you support the notion of medical marijuana. So that's going to be an important facet of this debate to keep an eye on moving forward. Now, there is one group that has consistently opposed legalization of marijuana for medical purposes, and that's law enforcement. Law enforcement has not been quite as active in this debate as they have been in years past, but we have reached out to some of our friends in that line of work because, again, they do raise some important perspectives, and while I don't necessarily agree with them, the perspective of law enforcement in this debate has helped shape some of my views on the issue. I do think they raised some good points, and we hope next week to have a law enforcement friend come on and give their side of this story. All right, so my favorite story this week was one from Richland County, South Carolina, involving a local educrat who allegedly threatened some parents at a school board meeting. Obviously, this is a growing trend across the country, conflict between parents and educrats over the education of their children. Our Dylan Nolan, who produces this segment, actually wrote the story. So we got Dylan to come out from behind the camera and come on set with us today to tell us a little bit about the story in Richland County School District 2. Hey, Dylan.
Why, hello. Yes, I'm on the other side of the cameras here because this story that just kind of fell into my lap this week is absolutely ridiculous. If you didn't get a chance to read the story originally, let me fill you in a little bit. Basically, there are two parents who are among this group of parents who disagree with the policies of the Richland 2 School Board, who frequently come to school board meetings, and they send emails to the school board. They're very involved. And they certainly do not have a congenial relationship with Superintendent Davis. Now, one of the two introduced themselves to his wife, or so his story goes, and she became quite agitated, began harassing them, and this dispute eventually escalated into what almost became a physical altercation that was stopped only by the security that were provided by the school. Now, this is the story that was told by the people who were in the room. I went back and forth with a representative from the school district 5 times before going to press. However, they never gave me a statement. I did, however, receive an angry phone call, and the day after the school district put out this statement, I'd like to read some of the parts of that so that you can hear their side of the story. The school district denies that the superintendent intended any physical contact or that he initiated any physical contact of any sort. They say that once Dr. Davis had become aware that his wife had been harassed, he went over to, quote, check on her, and that the individual who says that Dr. Davis attacked him, in fact, stepped forward and responded loudly. The district says at no time did Dr. Davis make any physical or verbal threats to the individual, and they also say, unfortunately, the incident has become a distraction that overshadows the accomplishments of Richland II teachers and students. The next day, I followed up with a story of a lawsuit that has been filed earlier this week, alleging that the school was negligent in failing to prevent her son from being fairly brutally sexually abused by other members of the school's basketball team. The lawsuit alleges that there was a pattern of abuse that the school did not take adequate steps to intervene to prevent. So it's been a pretty rough week for Richland School District 2. As always, this outlet maintains an open microphone policy. I would love to speak to anybody who has anything to say on either side of this issue, and I would welcome you to sit down in this chair so that we can have a conversation about what really went down.
Now, I would also encourage parents from any school district in any county in South Carolina to please let us know if you ever see your superintendents, your school officials, teachers, you name it, elected officials, school board members behaving badly. Again, it's all about accountability, and our microphone is open to parents, to teachers, to superintendents, you name it. But again, if you see your elected officials, particularly at the local level, behaving badly, let us know.
Obviously, we understand that schools are really important to a lot of people who read this website, so we're going to do our utmost to try to hold the leaders of those institutions to a standard of excellence. Now I'm going to talk to Liz Farrell, who is on Hilton Head Island, about a story that she wrote this week about a disbarment of a local attorney. Here we are on Zoom with Liz Farrell, our executive editor. I'll let her take it from here.
So this week we had a story about a lawyer named Christy Ann Misaki. She was out of North Carolina and she moved her practice to South Carolina after she started getting in trouble with the North Carolina bar. So almost right away, she got in trouble here. The South Carolina Bar Association and the Office of Disciplinary Counsel started receiving complaints about her behavior and sort of, just basic things like not answering texts or emails and phone calls and things like that. And soon it was discovered that she was up to much more than that. So she was arrested on 2 counts of forgery and then subsequently indicted on several federal charges, including identity theft and counterfeiting as well. So she had allegedly done that with 2 co-conspirators. And it's a really interesting case, not only because of the details of the case and just sort of what she was up to and how she was sort of going about that, but because of the conversation that we're having now with the Alec Murdaugh case and attorney misconduct. And it kind of shows you, how swiftly the ODC acted, what kind of investigation was conducted, and how much they found out. So there are a lot of details in this case. If anyone wants to read more about it, they can go to our website and check it out, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you so much, Liz.
All right, so I want to thank Liz for that report out of the Low Country. So we've looked at the Low Country, we've looked at the Midlands part of the state. I want to take us now to the PD. Now, this is the Interstate 95 corridor between the coast and the Midlands. It's one of the more impoverished parts of South Carolina. It's a part of the state where population growth has really lagged behind the rest of the state, where income levels are lower. There's not as much opportunity in this part of the state, and there's a big Senate race in Florence County. 2 candidates offering competing visions on how to change that. Now, this race was very combative. It pitted a 4th-term state representative by the name of Jay Jordan against a political newcomer, a businessman, local car owner by the name of Mike Reichenbach. Now, all of the money, all of the influence, all of the power, whether in Columbia, at the State House, or in Florence, all the insiders, all the institutions were behind Jay Jordan. Jay Jordan was supposed to walk away with this race. It was supposed to be a drubbing, okay? Guess what? He got beat. Mike Reichenbach came out of nowhere and won this race by 4 percentage points. A huge upset, not just of Jay Jordan, but of the local Florence establishment and the State House establishment that was aligned behind Jordan's candidacy. Now, this race is significant because it sends a message to politicians in Columbia that status quo Republicans who haven't done much on behalf of taxpayers are officially now an endangered species. Now, my news outlet covered this race from the very beginning, from the first television ads. We followed its many twists and turns, including a big scandal over a low-income housing development that was tied to some of Jay Jordan's donors. We also covered some of the special interest money that flowed into this race, most of it from Jordan supporters trying to conceal the direction of their donations. A lot of big stories, a lot of contentiousness, combativeness in this race. But again, ultimately, the political newcomer, the community activist, the guy who did not have the support of the status quo, Mike Reichenbach, pulled a huge upset victory. Now, we're going to be very interested in following his career moving forward. Obviously, we were supportive of his candidacy, but I'm going to tell you something, and I want Mike Reichenbach to listen to this. You will be held accountable for your votes the same way that Jay Jordan was held accountable for his. Taxpayers in Florence need you to live up to your promises, and we're going to make sure that you do. All right, so before we cut out this weekend, there's one last segment I wanted to look at, and that's a potential congressional catfight down in the South Carolina Lowcountry, where incumbent Nancy Mace has ticked off a lot of Republican primary voters for her comments over a year ago directed toward Donald Trump in the aftermath of the U.S. Capitol riots. Now, Mace has been on Trump's Scheisse list, and I won't translate that German for you, but it's not a good thing. She's been on his target list, we'll say, ever since last November, when the former president came out with a list of 10 members of Congress he wanted to see defeated in the June 2022 elections. Nancy Mace was on that list. In fact, he is actively recruiting candidates to run against her. Now, has Trump found his woman? Possibly. Former state representative and Department of Defense analyst Katie Arrington, who ran for the seat back in 2018, is eyeing a challenge against Nancy Mace. And in fact, we were told and exclusively reported just today that there's a poll in the field addressing Arrington and Mace and that potential race. Now, these two served together in the South Carolina House of Representatives, had a very contentious relationship. In fact, lawmakers who spoke with me about Katie Arrington and Nancy Mace basically say these two women hate each other. And not only is there the personal animus, but there's an ideological difference too. Katie Arrington is very pro-Trump, could even end up getting the former president's endorsement, whereas Nancy Mace has branded herself as a new voice for the Republican Party, implying again that Trump is the old voice and that she's something different for voters. Now, this primary election could be hot. It could be testy. It could get nasty, again, with two candidates that really don't like each other, but could also be a litmus test for Donald Trump in South Carolina, because again, this isn't the only congressional district that Trump's going to play in. Remember, just up the coast in the 7th congressional district, we've got Tom Rice, who was one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump last January. So not one, but 2 members of Congress in South Carolina are being targeted for defeat by Donald Trump, and we will keep a close eye on both those races moving forward. I just want to thank you again for joining us on the Week in Review. I want to thank Dylan Nolan and Liz Farrell for their contributions to this program. I also want to thank those of you who support us with your subscriptions, with your clicks. I want to thank our advertisers, and also I want to let everybody know if you want to advertise on our show, reach out to Andrea Holloway, Andrea@FITSNews.com. She's ready to help you, give you all the information you need if you want to support what we're doing. And speaking of that, one of our newest advertisers that are going to be coming on in the coming weeks is a podcast called Bourbon in the Back Room. It's hosted by Vincent Shaheen and Joel Lurie, 2 former Democratic senators. And both of those guys had me on just this week for their podcast. Had a great time. Looking forward to it airing. They asked some great, insightful, tough questions, and also took the time to give some context on the South Carolina political history that we discussed. So Bourbon in the Back Room, you can check it on Spotify and your Apple Podcasts. And also, don't let me forget the podcast you really want to follow, the Murdaugh Murders podcast by our own Mandy Matney. Mandy has been covering this story from the very beginning, even before she came to work for FITSNews. Her podcast, The Definitive Public Record on the Murdaugh investigation, which again continues to generate national and even international attention. That's a story that we've been driving from the beginning, and we will have more news on the Murdaugh saga this coming week.